Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Adriel Boals of Hobnob Games, and this is the third tutorial of our intermediate series. And today we're going to be talking about getting inside your opponent's heads. As always, you can find us at hobnob.games, where you can find this video along with all of our videos and download and play on our poker app. So today we're going to be talking about getting inside your opponent's heads. And as someone who is a professor of psychology, I would like to think I know a little something about this, and particularly how it prepares us and relates to playing poker. So one of the first things I want to talk about is this idea of level 2 thinking. If you recall back to our previous tutorial, we talked about level 1 thinking, just thinking about the strength of your hand. But level 2 thinking is trying to understand what cards my opponents could possibly hold. So level 2 thinking is kind of our first step into getting inside of our opponent's heads. Another thing is know thy enemy. This is really important because part of getting inside of your opponent's heads is we need to look at what they do, what they say, what actions they take, and that can help us start to narrow down what cards they might be holding. So it's critically important that you know your opponent, that you know their playing style, that you know their tendencies. And this is going to be something we're going to focus a bit more on in our next tutorial video. But for right now, I want to remind everyone how important it is to know thy enemy. And also a critical part of getting inside of our opponent's heads is to think about all possibilities, all possible things that they could be thinking about, all possible cards that they could be holding. And this is a really crucial skill to help improve your poker game. So for example, I have heard, and maybe you have also heard, many poker players say before, and maybe you've even said it yourself. You'll hear a poker player say, after a hand is over, I put you on ace king. As soon as I hear a poker player say this, I immediately know they do think on level 2. They are thinking, they say, hey, I put you on ace king. They are thinking about what cards their opponents are holding. So technically that's level 2, but it's a very weak version of level 2 thinking because they're not considering all the possibilities. They're trying to narrow down what their opponent is holding to one hand. And that's not what pro poker players do. Professional poker players are always considering all possibilities. What are all the reasonable cards or hands that my opponent could be holding? And yes, every now and then you might see someone like Daniel Negreanu be able to call out the exact specific hand that their opponent holds. But even if he were here, I think he would admit that one, he's only been able to do it a handful of times. They just happen to get caught on TV. And two, even in those moments, he started by considering all the possible cards his opponents could be holding, and it was just really able to narrow it down to one that he was very confident about. So again, poker pros are always considering all possible hands. And to help us really underscore the importance of considering all possibilities, I am actually going to show you a quick, very quick video clip from Game of Thrones, in which Peter Littlefinger Baelish is giving some advice about war.
Don't fight in the north or the south. Fight every battle, everywhere, always, in your mind. Everyone is your enemy. Everyone is your friend. Every possible series of events is happening all at once. Live that way, and nothing will surprise you. Everything that happens will be something that you've seen before.
Okay, so here he's giving some advice about war. Now, how does that relate to poker? Well, to quote poker pro Doyle Brunson, poker is war. You're going to battle against your opponents. And his advice here is actually really good. It's so important that you're considering all the possibilities. Play out every possible reasonable scenario in your head. That way, when your opponent flips the cards over, you're never surprised. It was always something that you had seen before, meaning you had mentally envisioned this is one of the possible holdings that my opponent could have. So let's walk through an example. So this is a 2-5 cash game in which there's $1,000 effective stacks. So we're 200 big blinds deep. And during the pre-flop action, the under the gun plus ones, this is someone in a very early position, raises to $20. That's a fairly standard raise size in this particular 2-5 game. Now, anytime you're in a hand and your opponent does an action, I want you to get in a habit of immediately mentally doing this right here. Come up with our starting hand chart that we talked about in the beginner series. And you're always going through this hand chart and thinking about all the possible scenarios. Here's all 169 possible scenarios, but let's really narrow it down to what we consider reasonable scenarios, the reasonable hands that our opponents would hold. Well, if someone from early position raises, most poker players at their 2-5 level understand that playing out of position puts you at a disadvantage. Hence, you should only be willing to play out of position if you have at least a fairly strong hand. So most poker players at this stage know if they raise some early position, they probably have a pretty good hand. So for instance, they probably don't have 10-3 offsuit, or they probably don't have, or I'm sorry, I guess that would be 10-3 suited. They probably don't have 10-5 offsuit, all those junk hands. We can discount all of those. We'd also consider the person's what we call an uncapped range. It's uncapped because it would go all the way up to the strongest possible hand. Could this person have pocket aces? Absolutely. So this is an uncapped range. And so this right here represents the top 16% of hands that someone has. I think, you know, and again, this could vary depending on your opponent. Know thy enemy. If it's a maniac person who's raising with any 2 cards, well, then maybe we want to widen this out. But maybe this is a player who plays fairly conservative, and we could say, okay, here's a reasonable range of hands this player can have. Then someone in middle position calls. And in this particular hand, this middle position player is an older gentleman who plays very, very conservatively. So this is a player who could be considered a rock style of play. They're not going to be calling with weak hands. So as soon as this person calls, now we want to create a hand chart for this person and think through all the possible hands this person could be holding. Now he's going to be holding what we call a capped range. It's capped because we can discount the strongest hands. For instance, pocket aces. This player, if they had pocket aces, probably would have 3-bet this person. And they didn't 3-bet, they just called. Hence, it caps their range. So we can probably disclude aces, kings, and queens because he would probably 3-bet. Same thing with ace-king. This particular player, I had seen 3-bet with ace-king before, so I'm fairly confident that when he just calls, does not have ace-king. Pocket jacks is something to really think about, and really this is where it really helps to know your opponent. Some people will 3-bet with pocket jacks almost every time. Some people will almost never because they're scared to play pocket jacks. If you know your opponent, you can know whether pocket jacks is in their range or not. But we include like a bunch of suited aces, a bunch of unsuited Broadway, 2 Broadway cards, some suited Broadways, all the way down to like king 9 suited, jack 9 suited, some pocket pairs on down to pocket 6s. Here we got our suited 1 gappers, and over here maybe we have suited 2 gappers on down to 9-7 suited. So again, you know, it helps to know your opponent, but this is what I would come up with as a fairly reasonable range of hands that this particular player could have. Then we are the hero, and we call this. Now, right now, I'm not going to tell you what cards we hold. Not that it's not important, but I want us to get in a habit and practice of level 2 thinking, of spending the majority of our time thinking about what our opponents have and less time worried about how strong is our hand. So going to the flop, there's now $60 in the pot in 3 ways. And the flop comes down 10-6-2 rainbow. Rainbow meaning that they're all 3 different suits. And under the gun +1, our early position original raiser, bets $40 into the $60 pot. Okay, so I immediately want to pull up my hand chart in my head and start thinking about what hands. And you might notice that it's the exact same as it was before. I don't think that this action that this player took changes our range of hands in any way, because this is fairly standard at 2-5 poker for someone to do a continuation or a C-bet in this manner. So the fact that the pre-flop raiser here is C-betting, especially on this particular flop, where this person probably realizes everyone missed this flop, I might be able to take it down with a C-bet. So the fact that this player C-bets, I think, tells us nothing, and I'm going to keep the same hand chart I had before. Then our conservative player in middle position calls the $40 bet. Okay, this is something significant. I think we can start to narrow down the hands a little bit here, because at the very least, our person in middle position has something. Doesn't have to be the strongest hand, but I think they have to have at least some type of strength to their hand in order to make this call. So I think that we can, you know, I'll still include a bunch of, they just have 2 overcards. So all of our ace jack, for instance, and king queens, I'm going to go ahead and hold that in the range. Sometimes middle position might fold those 2 cards, But right now, just like Peter Baelish, I don't want to be surprised by anything. So let's be fairly conservative here and continue to include the hands that include 2-over cards. We'll definitely include all the cards that include a 10 because he just flopped top pair. That includes here and that includes here. And it also includes cards in which got a 6, and that would include a 6 suited. And I think the pocket pairs also continue to at least call this bet. So after this, at this point, I think this is a reasonable range of cards that we can consider for middle position to have. And again, we're just going to call this bet. Now going to the turn, there's $180 in the pot. And the turn card is the 4 of spades. So kind of a blank card, continue to have a rainbow board. And under the gun +1 now bets $100 into a pot of 180. And again, I don't think it tells us that much. It tells us a little something, but for the moment, don't worry too much about this player's hands because he's not going to be relevant in a moment. What is relevant is middle position then raises to $300. Okay, we should be on high alert here. Now we really can start to narrow down what cards middle position is holding. What cards could he reasonably be holding right now? If we take out all the cards that we had before, I think that the only possibilities left is a set of 10s and a set of 6s. I think all the other hands, there are no flush possibilities here. 3-6 is the only thing that really has a straight, and we already decided from the pre-flop action that 3-6 is not a hand that this player likely is holding. I think that pocket 8s is maybe calls the bet, but it's not going to then raise, especially with us another player sitting behind. So when this player raises, when someone raises on the turn, they mean business, especially when they still have another person to act behind them. And again, this is a fairly conservative player. So the player is not going to do this with, for instance, I think with pocket 9s. This player's got a pretty strong hand. And I think we can, if we really think it through in this manner, we can really narrow it down to just 2 hands, set of 10s and set of 6s. I know that sounds fairly conservative, but I cannot think of any other reasonable hands given the action thus far in the hand this player can have. We call, and the original raiser folds, and so we don't have to worry about that player anymore. And now going to the river, there's $880 in the pot, and the card is the 4 of hearts. So it pairs the turn card, and the middle position now shoves his remaining $640 into the $880 pot. At this point, I'm going to tell you what we have. We've got pocket 2s. We flopped bottom set here. Now, at this point, I think if we had a level 1 thinker, a player who's only worried about the strength of their hand, they cannot wait to call here. They go, oh man, I flopped a set. Now it turned into a boat. I don't have to worry about flushes. I don't have to worry about straights. I've got a boat. That's a really strong hand. Snap call. But we can do better than that. We're not level 1 thinkers anymore. We're level 2 thinkers. We're spending the majority of our time focused on what does our opponent have. And the fact that this player then shoved when the board paired, just to me confirms these are pretty much the only 2 possible hands I think this player can have. And that would be a set of 10s or a set of 6s. There is no other reasonable hand. So if you're doing this through level 1 thinking, I think you have a snap call. If you do level 2 thinking, I think that it leads us to actually a pretty easy fold. It might not be emotionally easy to fold a set that turned into a boat, which is actually, you might go back and say, well, if you thought they only had 10s and 6s, why did you call the turn knowing that you were probably beat at that point? Well, because I think it's really hard for people to fold a set, and I would be included there. Sometimes you just have to call once and see what happens on the river. And on the river, when this player then shoves, now it's confirmation. This player either has pocket 10s or pocket 6s. If you call, you're going to get beat. So it turns out if you do level 2 thinking, again, it's not emotionally easy to fold this hand. And sometimes you look at someone who makes a big laydown and they do it correctly and you go, how did you do that? This is how they do it. They did a really good job of thinking through all the possible cards and then narrowing it down based on the action. And again, knowing your opponent. So if you get in the practice of regularly practicing this procedure here, constantly using that hand chart and using it to think about all the possible hands that your opponents have, the next time you hear another fellow poker player say something like, I put you on ace king, under your breath, you can chuckle a little bit and know that that is a weak level 2 thinker. We're doing better than that. So what's next? In our next tutorial, I'm going to do getting inside your opponent's heads part 2. So as always, you can find this video along with all of our videos and play in our poker app at hobnob.games. See you next time.